Hello, my name is David Plylar, and I'm a senior music specialist and concert producer for concerts from the Library of Congress. It is my great pleasure to be joined today by members of the Dudok Quartet Amsterdam, including Judith van Driel, Marlene Vester, Marie-Louise de Jong, and David Faber. Thank you all for being here so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
We're so happy that the quartet was able to join us virtually in the midst of this ongoing pandemic. Of course, we had hoped to have you in person, and down the road, we hope that that's a possibility as well. When we began this all a year ago, we didn't anticipate that this we'd still be dealing with the kind of circumstances that we are now. So we're grateful for every opportunity that we have to hear what musicians are up to and to be able to support them in any way that we can. So welcome. I just thought we'd dive into talking a bit about the program that you'll be presenting and that will be available for people to watch online. And you've got a very interesting one in that it includes works by Webern, Ligeti, and Brahms. And so I thought we could maybe just jump in with talking about your experiences with Webern and what attracts you to his music and these particular pieces. You'll be playing the Langsamer and the Opus 28 string quartet.
Yeah, well, I think when we started rehearsing these pieces, we started both of them together because we think the combination, one piece strengthens the other very much in our concept. It's very good to see that it's the same person trying to express himself in more or less the same way because it's both written for string quartet, but with quite a different result.
Yeah, but there's in both is of course the Langsamer is very, very lyrical, but this lyricalness is also in the string quartet very much, and the stretching of the gestures and yeah, this feeling is also in there, I think. Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with that assessment, especially they're separated by some 32, 33 years. I think the Langsamer is from 1905 or so. And we actually have the Library of Congress has an interesting relationship to, a little bit to the Langsamer, but then also to the Opus 28 quartet, which was, I think, was it 1938 or around that time? It's one of the last chamber works of Webern. But interestingly, through the Hans Moldenauer, divided up his collection amongst a number of different institutions, and the library has the autographed manuscripts of his other 1905 string quartet of Webern's, as well as the 1906 Rondo, which is not performed too much, but is actually also an interesting piece. So we have those there. And then for the Opus 28, that was dedicated as a commission of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who's the founder of our series. And so we have a copyist manuscript of that one with Webern's annotations. I think most of his materials are at the Sacher-Stiftung, but we've got that as well as a piano version that was done in the 60s. So it's kind of a strange collection, but we definitely have a connection to Webern, and it's very interesting to be able to look at these pieces. But I'd love for you to say a bit more about these connections that you see between the expressiveness of the larger scale. It's kind of weird to think of the earlier work as being the larger scale piece versus the three movement kind of very constricted piece later. And but that's my assessment too, is that there's this very expressive quality to each of them.
Yeah. I think it's just the rules of the game, so to say, that are different. But the way he tries to express it's funny if you see it, the way he does it in the Langsamer Satz. He writes a lot of words to indicate how we should play the feelings. And I think later on in his life, he decided not to write so many words anymore. But on the other hand, he writes a lot of dynamics and articulation signs and stuff like that. And also, our intervals can be very, very wide. So it's most of it, the theme is grammatical, of course, but then he writes it in a way that we have to play ba ba, you know, like this, and that's already very expressive. If we should sing it, would be dramatically expressive, I guess.
It's hard to not be expressive. It's almost inherent. Yeah.
Yeah. What is catching my eye mostly is that Webern is trying to find new ways of writing for string quartet. He has to sort of legitimize the fact that he's writing for string quartet at all in the 1930s. And so the music has a newness to it. For instance, in the use of the 12-tone row, and also because it's super condensed as opposed to the langzame Satz. But still, you feel all the time that he's so much respecting the heritage of the genre that he's like trying to build something new, but really not destroying the rest in ways. But look, for instance, the form is just like a strict. There's many strict canons there, and imitative forms, and the scherzo and trio. All of this like 17th, 18th, 19th century influences are just there. So some people regard this piece as a really modern and abstract piece, but so much of the framework is so super romantic.
Yeah, it fits in a tradition very clearly, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can also maybe in the dance references, and looking at Schoenberg's tradition there as well, coming at where there's almost this element of, as they get more away from tonality in the way that we're used to thinking of it, there's a crystallization of structure and those types of things that are still in that familiar territory that kind of allow you to ground yourself. I think that's it's interesting to start with those pieces and then to kind of go to another extreme of a composer I love dearly with Ligeti. And I know that you play both of the quartets, and we're going to get to hear the second one here. Maybe you could say a little bit about your experience with this quartet.
Well, actually, when we started working on the first quartet, because I mean, when you're like in conservatory and you start a new group, everyone's like, all the teachers are like, oh, you got to do Ligeti first. It's like a showpiece.
Yeah,
in many ways. It's
very good for competitions also.
Yeah, I mean, you can just you take 17 minutes of airtime and you can just show what the 19th century string quartet can be.
Right.
Yeah, all the extremes are in there.
Yeah, and many quartets stay with only playing the first. But I think I don't remember who it was who put us on the path of playing the second, actually. Or was it just our own curiosity?
Us, yeah.
Yeah, we were like, we were wondering why do so much less people play the second quartet, actually. Second quartet is much more in the territory of contemporary specialist groups still, even though it's 60 years old, but it's played mainly by groups that are specialized in contemporary works. And we thought there has to be it's the same person, so it should be interesting for us as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we started working on it, and then, we found out why so little quartets play this piece, because it's very, very, very hard. But on the other hand, there are so many similarities with the first quartet. So when you study them both, it's very helpful, because you see it's just part of a tradition. And many, many elements which seem a bit abstract at first sight, first hearing. When you look at the first quartet, you see where it's coming from. So it makes much more sense.
There's some aspects of the quartet that I think are, you kind of mentioned the crystallization of structure earlier with Webern, but we have things where there's a focus, where there's it's almost like the fantasy on a tone, or the focus on a pizzicato, for quite a large period of one movement in particular, or the alternation of pitches, and where there's a clear kind of a musical focus that is not related necessarily to a larger structural thing, but almost more of a textural one. And one thing that strikes me about this piece and a lot of Ligeti's music from this period in particular, I think this is from 1968 or so, that I think it's harder for somebody to appreciate it unless you can look at the score. It's just that while it is extremely difficult, I'm not a string player, but I'm just imagining that it's extremely difficult to play and to play well. There's something about Ligeti's being so hyper-specific and very clear about the relationships between, when you're changing to groups of 7 to 8 to 9 and how those relate to everyone, that it's doable, at least. It's accomplishable. This sort of massive sound is achievable because he's so specific with how you are supposed to achieve it. And I imagine that that's a challenge, but does his notation help to enable you to kind of achieve the musical effects you're looking for?
Yeah, and if you really go for it, it's really rewarding also, because he really knows which effect he's aiming for and what to ask for, but we had to push ourselves to those limits also, because it's
sometimes he writes, for instance, in the fourth movement, like 5 times fortissimo sign, which is like, there's extremely loud. In Webern wants extremely loud. He writes 3 times, and then Ligeti writes 5 times. But you cannot measure the amount of the volume to some extent. So I'm not sure if Ligeti wants you to do like divide the Webern fortissimo by 3 and multiply by 5. I think he's more trying to get you to really have a good concept of what he's saying musically by expressing it should be 5 times forte. He just wants you to take it and to think about it for a while, and then say something highly personal.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't he often, when he does that, he'll follow it with an extremely soft, like a very ethereal type of effect, so that the contrast is so clear. Maybe it's just a psychological game to get the players to react in those extremes. I don't know, but that's
it's like researching a dramaturgic process. Like he's putting these extremes and trying to ask of the listener, what if these two would happen together? And then, because music has to evolve over time, you cannot let 2 things happen together which you want to clearly distinct. So he tries to move away from the line which Webern is making in the Langzeimersatz, like the dramatic development, by making these blocks, more or less.
In a way, I think he's more related to Haydn than to the early Webern, so to say, because he's playing with your expectation of what's next to come. Yeah. And also, I think the way one should listen to this music, it's so different from listening to Webern or Brahms. So if you try to listen in a different way and to be open for something totally new in terms of structures and lack of development, because there's not a development like we're used to in our Western history. It's very rewarding also to listen to it, because it's so fresh and new and exciting.
Absolutely. One thing that I would just add in there, just for a thought that occurs to me, is that I think that there's an element of development that is clear to the ear at the local level that can be compared to the Brahms, just to kind of segue into that, which is that when you have like a lot of times when the Ligeti, it'll have a figure, and then that figure will grow and grow, maybe speeding up a little bit, but it tends to do so not just sort of erratically, but kind of over a process, and then maybe it expands or contracts and things like that. And I see that as, to me, it seems a little bit like an extension of the types of play that Brahms would do with his rhythmic things, or with metrically, with superimposing 3 against, or a 6/8 against a 2/4, or of course other composers too before Brahms, but just to fit into our what's coming up towards the end of your program with the Brahms third quartet, as well as the intermezzo, which we'll talk about in a minute. But maybe looking at the quartet first, is this one of the motivations that or what are the motivations that brought you to kind of bring together Brahms with Ligeti and Webern?
Well, I think, I don't know if it's if we really talked about this as such, but there's one very interesting interest which both Brahms and Ligeti had in common, and that was interest for very ancient music, like Renaissance music or even music from before that time. And that's interesting because there these structures are already there, or they did exist and they turned out to be something else in the 19th century. So Brahms is already returning to this, back to this, hoe zeg je het meer korig?
The Foley choral kind of structuring, like the viola and cello putting something forward and the two violins responding to it in a way which is more related relating to the music of Gabrieli or Palestrina than to the music of Beethoven. Mm-hmm. And actually, Ligeti said about the 19th century that all the music written in the 19th century is very suspect because it has to do so much with ego and personality. But Brahms, he is from the 19th century, but he was much an anachronism.
Yeah, he was doing something different. He was really looking back in a good way and taking stuff from the past and bringing it into his own, in his own work.
And leaving the ego more or less aside, like the Wagner types.
Well, that's, speaking of Wagner, I mean, you're looking at I think the time period for the third string quartet is right at 1876, is right when the Ring cycle is premiered, right? And so it couldn't be a greater contrast. That's a really interesting point you just made about that, that reflection back. And it made me think of another thing that Ligeti does that's similar to what Brahms does on occasion, which is that the notion of kind of unison writing across octaves for periods of time, that kind of comes into play as I don't know, they both seem to do that at times, and Ligeti actually more so, I think, in the second quartet, for longer passages, and I guess that's also something that he would do. I'm thinking of the three pieces for two pianos, where he has the Chopin, the finale of the Chopin second piano sonata is a inspiration for him to kind of have a single line that gets divided up amongst everybody, and you speed through it and you kind of create this amazing texture from it, which I know is at a far remove from, say, choral music, so to speak, but there's something about this referentiality that it removes it from the, like you said, the ego of the initial creator that creates something just inherently musical that I think is fascinating to think about. So I appreciate that thought very much. So I'm assuming you played all the Brahms quartets. Is there a particular favorite for you? This is of course a very different one. It's the major key one.
But they're so different that it's hard to say.
Even the movements are so different.
Yeah. No, I think before Maëlys joined 4 years ago, we have played the second quartet the most, I think, before that.
Yeah.
And then since last 2 or 3 years, we took up the other two, the first and the third. The second, I think, is most clear in all the what it wants to say and how you should do it. It's like, like a famous Vermeer painting or Rembrandt, or it's like just there, masterpiece, great, enjoy. And the first and third are a bit more specific. I think the first especially is really tough. I mean, you have to be so engaged in order to make something out of it. And at the same time, it engages you in a way. Just the first bars are already like explosive energy. And the third, I think, works best if you just treat it like something which is meant for musicians.
Yeah.
Like Haydn wrote a string quartet for us to enjoy. And then
Brahms himself, he said, first play some Haydn quartets, and then six, six or so.
Yeah, you should concert with some Haydn quartets and then perform the third string quartet he wrote. So, and then there's audience there which can enjoy us having fun, more or less. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have the weight of the world in the finale, like some some works by Brahms have that sort of feel to it with the variations, and so yeah, there's an element of just a kind of a free play sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very playful in a way.
Yeah. And also, it's interesting to see that he leaves more space for the players, because in the first quartet everything is so dense that even if we want to play freely, it's very hard because there are always three others playing something else exactly at the same time. And in the third quartet, it's more, there's more air, literally.
A bit more open construction or something.
Yeah.
That's interesting. The Library of Congress has a very large collection of Brahms manuscripts, including some major chamber works like the Opus 34 Quintet, one of the sextets, Third Symphony, some other things too. But one of the things that I'm so pleased that you put on your program is that is Opus 119 number 1. We have we have Opus 118 number 1, 119 1, actually 119 1, 2, and 3, and they're it's so interesting to see these manuscripts compared to the earlier Brahms, because they're just these tiny rectangular. I'm trying to get in the picture here. Tiny rectangular manuscripts that are quite different from from what he would write on earlier, and but they're just absolutely stunning and beautiful. And I've heard some of your transcriptions of Brahms piano pieces, and they're just they're stunning and beautiful themselves. And so I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that transcription, if you'd like, or also just your transcriptions in general.
Well, I think the Brahms transcriptions are among the first we did, like 7 years ago. And we started making transcriptions in general because it forces you to get into the mind of a composer. Try to deconstruct what he made and try to make something new with the same material, without trying to become a contemporary composer, but trying to, like, in a hermeneutic way, trying to understand what is a composer living in the 19th century doing. So that's why we started with Brahms. I think I just wanted to be able to perform these pieces, and I'm a very bad pianist.
Yeah, but then it's very interesting, because for his string quartets he did the same. He composed it for the piano first, and then he wrote it for strings. So you immediately see the difficulties which are there, or the things which are pretty easy if you play it on a piano can be very difficult if you write it for strings. So you have to adapt a little bit. And then we found out that he wanted to use this theme for maybe the slow part of a symphony. So we found out that he had plans already for using this music in a different way. So we didn't feel very guilty that we did it ourselves.
Well, sure. He engaged a little bit himself of that too, and of course he did a huge number of. He's one of the most prolific transcribers of his own music for four hands, and things like that. So that was he might complain, if it were a hack job, but you're not doing a hack job. So I think that you're doing good. One of the I think that's fascinating what you're saying about how it helps you to get inside the minds of the composers. But I noticed just listening through some of your other transcriptions. Do you all transcribe, or is it mostly just David? Or
the two of us.
I did a little bit. Yeah.
But actually, when I make a transcription, I bring like a half finished product to the rehearsal, and then we finish the four of us. So when you look at the sheet music, like half of it's there.
Got it.
So it's really a common product. We make it also in the rehearsal.
Well, that's in some of the because you also do, in addition to things like Brahms. I know that you have one of the Hungarian dances that's been transcribed. But you also do some earlier music. You have Gesualdo, some Schütz, where I heard some certain choices that you're making in terms of pizzicato accompaniments versus there might not be the exact types of things that composer might have chosen to do, which is I really appreciate, which I think is a fun thing to be able to listen to what a modern take on a transcription can be. Do you have future? Is it just kind of the music that strikes you at the time? That's what draws you to it to transcribe it, or do you have a plan to explore certain other musics?
Yeah, well, those old pieces is also because of Ligeti being interested in it and Brahms. So we want to know this music. We want to be busy with music also from before Haydn, because it matters to know the whole tradition that leads up to these composers. Yeah.
I think we always pick the music by at the hand of the composer of who we are playing an actual string quartet. Yeah. So if it's the Schütz and the Gabrieli are because Brahms was so much engaged with the music by Schütz and Gabrieli actually, and he made the revisions of the first editions of this music by Gabrieli, I think. And so it helps us understand Brahms' thinking a bit better. So, and as Marlene said, most string quartets start playing music that was written in 1770, like Haydn. But he was just standing in the middle of a great tradition of chamber music. But it's not written for string quartet.
Yeah.
So we more or less get into the tradition.
Yeah, we don't want to see Haydn as the start of the string quartet music, because it's more about music.
Yeah, and most four-part music before Haydn was just vocal, so you really don't want to hear us sing.
Well, now I do, but one thing that I thought was also fascinating, maybe you could speak a bit about, is how you've been adapting to the situation that we're in right now, and this is partly through your signature sessions that I think your third one is now available. And one of the things that I really appreciated about it is that you were offering some of these transcriptions, the sheet music for it, so that people could try it out themselves. But maybe you could speak a bit about those projects and what's coming up.
Well, the reason why we offer these scores to the people is that we really want to share what we have and what we find in music. And at this moment, it's a bit difficult to share live music. So we thought of ways of sharing in a different way. And actually the signature sessions were on our wish list already for a longer time. And now we got a chance to really make it happen, which was great, I think. So actually the recordings are all done. We have quite a big library now.
I think we have like 16 more clips coming up. So
wow.
1.5 years.
Yeah.
So, and our next plans, well, live concerts are a bit difficult still, until who knows when. So we decided, we recorded our first Brahms album in November, last November, and we will record the second one in April, hopefully.
Yeah,
it's almost.
They will be released as a double album in October probably, and so it will comprise of the old 3 string quartets and the quintet, the string quintet, Opus 111.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then an additional thing we thought of was to perform them with gut strings, so unwound gut strings. Yeah.
Pure gut
strings. Yeah. And that was another wish we had for a long time. But when you're touring all over the world, it's a little bit difficult to start playing with those. So now we had the time to explore these things, and we recorded the first album already with gut strings, and the second as well.
I know this is probably difficult to nutshell, but can you give a sense of what the difference was for you as players in choosing in the experience of playing with gut string?
Yeah, it's mostly the how the string speaks. So this was mostly the hardest thing to get used to, I think. And the sound you hear at your ear, it's very different. And for me personally, to play very soft and legato was a very challenge. Yeah, but there was a lot of time to explore the options. But it also gives so much. The sound is really, really special. Like the group sound, it totally changes. So it was a lot of fun actually to explore it, and still is. So.
It's just the whole way of making colors. It's so different, and it's you in that way you hear much more of the different voices, which in our opinion is very important with Brahms, because the music is so dense, like we said, that it really helps if you hear the different sounds and the different colors within the voices.
It's funny because we had one teacher who studied for a long time with the members of the Dudok Quartet, and from him we always learned different techniques to make all 4 voices audible within a texture. But all these techniques we could just throw out the window when using gut strings, because the contact point is much more specific and you cannot really change it. For each note there's like one point where it works, and you go 1 millimeter closer to the bridge and it's like shrieking. And so it takes really, when you're more specific, it gives you a lot of sound, but when you're a bit aspecific, you could just as well not do it.
And it also changes your way of, it has to change your way of playing, because in terms of playing fortissimo, it's only possible up till a certain level, because when I play on a plain E string and I play too loud, well, I had to change it every 2 days anyway, and otherwise it just breaks and it doesn't sound. So in terms of dynamics, you have to make different choices, and that's very interesting because it's what Brahms had in that time. It was all he had, and so it gives a different perspective.
I think modern concert practice with us like touring and performing in halls, venues with up to 600 people, it would not really work with gut strings. With the plain gut strings. I mean, small halls, yes. Smaller venues would be fine.
But it would work in big halls, but people have to listen differently as well. We all got used to so much sound because it's possible on modern instruments that you have to listen in a different way.
You'd have to ask from the audience, just so you're sure we're like 20 decibels less.
It's healthy in a way.
It's good for your ears.
Right. Well, that's. I'm looking forward to hearing that very much. That would be. That sounds really fascinating. One last thing I wanted to ask you about before we close out is that it seems like you're also being creative in other ways, just to make some things happen while this is closed. I saw a recording that you did of string quintet and piano version of Beethoven 4 at the Concertgebouw. And do you have other projects and collaborations that you're able to still pursue, despite the circumstances that you're in?
Well, we made a podcast, but it's in Dutch. That's something we did.
There's a in Holland very famous composer, Theo Louvendi, who will be writing his second string quartet for us. Actually, he's writing it at the moment, and he wrote his first string quartet over 70 years ago. He's 91 now. So the world premiere is planned for like the fall, I think, fall of 2021.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And do you do a lot of new music as well, or do you? Is that a part of what you're continuing to do in addition to these kind of classics of? I guess you think of Ligeti as kind of a classic composer now.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see where it can lead. I mean, some string quartet as a genre for contemporary composers, it's still a bit steep challenge, because they think when they hear the word string quartet that it should be something very specific. But it's interesting to see what comes out, because with every person it's so different. I think we played almost a new piece each year for the last 7 years, at least one new piece, and all are so super different. Yeah, it's really fun.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think it's really a wonderful program, and I'm so glad that you're able to accomplish so much despite the difficult circumstances. And I wish you all the best with your upcoming recordings and performances.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.